Evan! You're breathing too loud. It's distracting the adults in the room. Mark Reynolds didn't even look up from his mahogany desk. The glass-walled boardroom was filled with the most powerful C-suite executives in the country. Mark adjusted his $2,000 suit jacket. His smirk was wide. It was predatory. Actually, why are you even here? The spreadsheet you spent 6 months failing to finish is already on my flash drive. Go fetch the catering tray, Evan. At least you won't trip over a decimal point doing that. A ripple of sharp, cruel laughter erupted from the senior VPs. Evan Carter stood frozen. He clutched his beat-up laptop. His face was burning. Mark leaned into the microphone. He wanted to ensure the 300 global employees on the Zoom link heard every single syllable of this humiliation. Look at him, Mark sneered. He pointed a red laser pointer directly at Evan's chest. The human personification of a system error. Get out, Evan. You're a stain on my floor. A literal garbage fire of an employee. Mark didn't wait for Evan to move. He turned his back. His posture radiated the absolute confidence of a man who had just stolen a year's worth of labor. Ladies, gentlemen, and board members, Mark announced. His voice boomed. It filled the room with unearned authority. Today I'll show you how I personally salvaged the North Star project from the brink of catastrophe. I did this despite the utter incompetence of the junior staff I was forced to oversee. He clicked the first slide. It was Evan's work. Every single cell. Every single formula. But it was rebranded. Mark's name was in bold gold lettering at the top. I stayed up for 72 hours straight fixing these projections. Mark lied. He didn't blink. Evan here couldn't even format a cell without crying like a child. The CEO nodded in approval. Mark's sycophants in the front row whispered loud enough for the Thiel's room to hear. Why hasn't he been fired yet? He's dead weight. Look at his hands shaking. Pathetic. Just pathetic, Mark, Evan said. His voice was thin, but it was clear. The room went silent. Mark froze. His neck turned a blotchy, angry red. He slowly turned around. His smugness twisted into a mask of pure, sharp irritation. Did the coffee machine speak? Mark asked. He stepped toward Evan. He got so close their chests almost touched. I gave you an order, you little parasite. If you say one more word that isn't an apology for existing in my department, I will personally escort you to the security desk. I will watch them strip your badge and throw you into the street. The board members shifted in their seats. Their eyes were cold. They looked at Evan like he was an insect. Mr. Carter? The CEO intervened. His voice was like ice. Mr. Reynolds is giving a critical presentation. Your presence is tolerated only if you are silent. Sit in the corner or leave this building immediately. Mark grinned. He was a shark sensing blood in the water. He reached out and physically shoved Evan's shoulder. He pushed him toward the back of the room. You heard the boss. Sit. Watch. Learn how a real director works. Maybe you'll learn how to be a man instead of a mistake. Mark returned to the podium. His ego was inflated to a bursting point. Now, as I was saying, the Q3 delivery was late solely because Evan forgot to ping the London server. It was a mistake I caught just in time. Barely. He clicked the next slide. It showed a massive $4 million loss mitigation strategy. I rerouted the assets myself. It was a masterclass in crisis management. I am the reason this company is still breathing. Mark didn't stop. He smelled fear. He thrived on it. Look at this chart, Mark barked, hitting the table with his palm. The sound echoed like a gunshot. This represents the efficiency Evan Carter failed to achieve. I had to rewrite his entire logic. I had to delete his trash code. I had to fix his life. He turned back to the board. And you know what the worst part is? He begged me. He literally begged me for a promotion while he was failing. He looked me in the eye and asked for more money while he was actively losing us millions. The CEO groaned in disgust. Is that true, Evan? You had the nerve to ask for a raise while underperforming? Evan opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked defeated. He looked broken. Mark laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound. See? He can't even lie properly. He's a hollow shell of a man. If I didn't have a heart, I would have fired him months ago. I kept him around as a charity project, but today, the charity ends. Mark clicked to a slide titled Termination Recommendation. Evan's name was there in huge red letters. I am recommending immediate dismissal. No severance. No references. We need to scrub this failure from the company archives. Mark leaned over the podium, staring directly into Evan's eyes. "Give me your laptop, Evan. You don't deserve the electricity it's using." Evan slowly stood up. His hands were shaking. He walked toward the front of the room. The junior staff in the back were looking away. They couldn't watch the execution. Mark reached out to grab the laptop, a triumphant sneer curling his lip. "Give it here, you waste of space." But Evan didn't hand it over. He stumbled. He tripped on the carpet and the laptop slid across the floor, crashing into the leg of the CEO's chair. "God, you're even clumsy when you're being fired," Mark shouted. He was enjoying this. This was his peak. "Pick it up. Pick up your failure and get out." Evan knelt on the floor. He looked small. He looked like he was about to cry. The board members were checking their watches. They were bored of the slaughter. "Finish this, Mark," the Chico said. "We have a meeting with the investors in 10 minutes. "Of course, sir," Mark said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I just want to ensure Mr. Carter understands that he is leaving with nothing. Absolutely nothing." Evan finally grabbed the laptop. He stood up slowly. He wiped a stray hair from his forehead. Suddenly the shaking stopped. His eyes weren't wet. They were cold. They were hard. "You're right about one thing, Mark," Evan said. His voice wasn't thin anymore. It was deep. It carried across the room. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting for this exact second. "I am leaving with nothing. Because I've already sent everything to the one place you can't reach." Mark's smile faltered. "Only for a second. What are you talking about? You're delusional. Security, get him out of here." "Wait," the CEO said, his eyes narrowing. "Evan, what did you send? And to whom?" "The Miller account," Evan said. He looked Mark dead in the eye. "I sent them the original logs, Mark. The ones from the London server. The ones that show you deliberately crashed the system 3 weeks ago just so you could save it on your birthday for a bonus." The room went deathly silent. Mark's face didn't turn red this time. It turned a sickly, chalky white. "That's a lie," Mark hissed. His voice was suddenly very quiet. "He's making it up. He's desperate." "Am I?" Evan asked. He didn't look at the CEO. He looked at the camera on the wall. "Everyone on the Zoom call, check your internal pings. I just uploaded a file called Mark Reynolds Fraud Log Bot EEF to the general channel. It's encrypted, but the password is Mark is a liar, all caps." The boardroom erupted into chaos. 300 employees on the Zoom call didn't hesitate. They clicked. They downloaded. They saw the truth. Mark's hands were shaking so hard he dropped his expensive fountain pen. It rolled across the floor. Ignored. "It's a virus," Mark screamed. He lunged for the main computer terminal. "Don't open it. He's hacking your personal data. He's trying to steal your identities." "Too late, Mark," Evan said. He didn't even move. He just watched Mark scramble like a rat in a flooded cage. "The CEO is already reading page 4, the page where you authorized a secret kickback from the vendor in exchange for a $50,000 luxury watch. The one you're wearing right now." The CEO's head snapped up. His eyes were like twin barrels of a shotgun. He looked at Mark's wrist. Then he looked at the document on his tablet. "Mark," the CEO whispered. It was a terrifying sound. "Explain this. Now." "I can't. It's a misunderstanding," Mark stammered. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "That watch was a gift from my wife. Evan forged those emails. He's using AI to mimic my writing style. Sir, you have to believe me." Evan didn't give him a second to breathe. He hit the next button on his remote. The giant 4K screen changed. It wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was a video. It was a high-definition recording from a hidden security camera in the server room. The timestamp said 2:00 a.m. Last Tuesday. The room watched in stunned silence as Mark Reynolds, the director of operations, crept into the dark room. He looked around nervously. He pulled out a thumb drive. He plugged it into the main frame. Then he started deleting the project backups while giggling to himself. "Is that your wife in the video too, Mark?" Evan asked. His voice was cold. It was surgical. "Or is that just another misunderstanding?" Mark's legs actually gave out. He slumped into a chair. His face was no longer white. It was a sickly, bruised shade of purple. The VPs who had been laughing at Evan 5 minutes ago were now moving their chairs away from Mark. They didn't want to be near the blast zone. You spied on me," Mark whimpered. He looked at the board members. He was looking for a single ally. He found none. "That's illegal. You can't do that. I'll sue the company." I'll sue you for everything you have. Sue me? Evan stepped closer. He was looming over Mark now. The power dynamic had completely flipped. With what money, Mark? I've already contacted the IRS. I sent them the records of your offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The one you used to hide the $2 million you embezzled from the North Star budget over the last 3 years. Mark gasped. He looked like he was suffocating. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out of his throat. He was defensive. He was panicked. Now he was desperate. And don't worry about the Miller account, Evan added, leaning in so his voice filled the room. They aren't leaving because of me. They're staying because of me. I spent the last 3 hours on the phone with their CEO. I showed them your fake reports. I showed them the real numbers. They've signed a 10-year extension on one condition. The CEO stood up. He walked over to Mark. He reached down and ripped the director's ID badge off his neck. The plastic clip snapped with a satisfying crack. And what was that condition, Evan? Evan smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had finally caught its prey. The condition was that Mark Reynolds never sets foot in this industry again. They want him blacklisted. Globally. Mark's head fell into his hands. He started to sob. It wasn't a dignified cry. It was a snotty, loud, pathetic wail. Please, Mark begged. I have a mortgage. I have a reputation. You can't do this to me in front of everyone. You did this to yourself, Mark, Evan said. You wanted a show. Well, the curtains are closing, and you're the only one who doesn't get a bow. Security, the CEO roared. The doors to the boardroom swung open. 2 massive guards stepped in. They didn't look at Evan. They looked at Mark. Mark tried to stand up. He tried to reclaim a shred of his former glory. Wait, I can explain the Cayman account. It was for tax strategy. Every director does it. He looked at the other VPs. Tell them it's normal. The VPs looked at the ceiling. They looked at their shoes. They looked anywhere but at Mark. He was a dead man walking. He was a ghost in a silk suit. Get him out of here, the CEO commanded. And Mark, don't bother coming back for your things. We're burning your desk. Literally. I want every trace of your fraud purged from this building by sunset. The guards grabbed Mark by the armpits. They lifted him out of the chair. Mark's feet dangled for a second. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. My phone, Mark shrieked. I need my phone. Evan reached onto the podium. He picked up Mark's gold-plated iPhone. He held it up. The light caught the screen. You mean this phone, Mark? The one the company paid for. The one you used to text your mistress using the corporate data plan. The room gasped. Mark's eyes went wide. He stopped struggling. He looked at Evan with pure unadulterated terror. How did you? I didn't just find the fraud, Mark, Evan whispered. He stepped closer. He made sure the microphone caught every jagged word. I found everything. Every lie. Every secret. Every pathetic little lie you committed while you were busy laughing at me. You thought I was a system error. No, Mark, I was the firewall. And you just got flagged. Evan dropped the phone into a glass of ice water on the table. Plop! The screen flickered. It turned green. Then it went black. Mark let out a strangled cry. It was the sound of a man watching his entire life dissolve in a cup of water. The guards didn't wait any longer. They dragged him toward the exit. But the hallway was full. The 300 employees who had been watching on Zoom. They weren't at their desks anymore. They were lined up in the hallway. It was a walk of shame. As Mark was dragged past, no one cheered. No one clapped. They just held up their phones. They were recording. They were capturing the sweat. They were capturing the snot. They were capturing the exact moment Mark Reynolds became a global meme for failure. Wait, Mark yelled as he reached the elevator. Evan, tell them I was a good boss. Just once. Tell them I helped you. Evan stood at the boardroom door. He crossed his arms. He watched the elevator doors start to close. You did help me, Mark, Evan called out. The hallway went silent. Everyone waited for the punchline. You taught me exactly what kind of man I never want to be. Now get out of my hallway. The elevator dinged. The doors shut. Mark was gone. The CEO turned to Evan. The tension in the room snapped. Evan, the CEO said. He looked at the board members. They all nodded at once. The North Star project needs a new director. Someone who actually knows how the London server works. Someone who doesn't buy their degrees from a website. Evan looked at the seat Mark had just been dragged from. It was empty. It was waiting. I'll take the job, Evan said. But I want Mark's office. I want it gutted. I want the mahogany desk thrown in the trash. I want a workspace that actually smells like honesty. Done, the CEO said. He held out his hand. Evan shook it. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Evan walked back to the podium. He looked at the camera. He knew Mark was probably watching on a borrowed phone somewhere in the lobby. Evan picked up the red laser pointer. He pointed it at the empty chair where Mark used to sit. To the person who just left, Evan said, his voice cold and final. You told me I was a stain on your floor. Well, the floor is clean now, and you're just the trash that got swept out. Evan hit the power button. The screen went black. The meeting was over. The revenge was complete. Mark Reynolds was currently standing on the sidewalk. It was raining. He had no phone. He had no watch. He had a wet suit and a ruined reputation. He looked up at the glass building. He could see the lights of the boardroom. He could hear the faint sound of people cheering for the man he had tried to destroy. Mark opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was silenced. He was nobody. He turned his collar up against the rain and started walking toward the subway. He didn't even have enough change for the fare.
Watching Mark Reynolds go from a self-proclaimed boardroom god to a snotty, sobbing meme on 300 employee phones, the exact level of pettiness I'm here for. He really thought he could treat a human being like a malfunctioning coffee machine and not get short-circuited. If you were in Evan's shoes, would you have stopped at exposing the corporate fraud? Or is leaking the personal sins like the mistress and the offshore watch the only way to ensure a snake like that stays buried? I actually spent a weird amount of time looking up how server pings and encryption logs work for this script. I wanted that Mark is a liar password reveal to feel like a digital slap in the face.